Unless you've been out of town for a while, you understand that last week, Brother Todd delivered a timely lesson in regards to the business of back to school, if you will, and that will, Lord willing, take place again this morning at 10:45. The last few years, he's been doing a great job delivering those types of lessons this time of year, both to assist our young people that are involved in the educational process and those that teach them. And I think that's very appropriate. You may disagree with what I'm about to say, but I think the conditions that our youth now experience in regards to temptations and trials and tribulations, societally, culturally, educationally, maybe even perhaps religiously, are at an all-time high from the standpoint of both severity and frequency. Our kids are exposed to some things from an opportunity and situation standpoint that us 60-plus year old folks in this audience never dreamed we'd ever see. Reese Ann's wearing one of those watches now that you can kind of communicate with. How many of you watched Dick Tracy cartoons as a kid and saw the wrist radio? And we looked at that and we thought, that'll never happen. But she can send me a text on her, or a voice text on her little phone that's on her wrist, and then I get tagged with a message through email, and I can respond to her. And I didn't think I'd ever see that day. No, she doesn't literally have a TV on her wrist, but we're there. And I don't know about you, but it's a different world now than it was in the 50s and the 60s. A far, far different world than it was. And it is impressive the amount of opportunities that our children have that are perhaps not healthy for them from a spiritual standpoint. Solomon in Psalm 127 talks about how valuable our children are to us. Beginning in verse 3, he says, "Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord. The fruit of the womb is a reward." I remember now what Eve said in Genesis, the 4th chapter, in the first verse. Do you remember what she said when she conceived and bore Cain? A little bitty short sentence. "I have acquired or gotten a man from the Lord." She understood that children were a blessing from God. Solomon goes on to say, a verse that I'm really fond of because I bow hunt, "Like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. Happy is the man who has a quiver full of them. They shall not be ashamed, but shall speak with their enemies in the gate." Imagine a warrior going into battle without enough bullets. Our kids make us complete. Not saying that not having children is a bad thing, but Solomon knew the value of having children, grandchildren. And so this morning I want to talk to you for a little while about them in regards to their spiritual value to us. I believe, and have said before, that they are the future of the Lord's church, His kingdom. And we need to understand that, and it is incumbent upon us as parents and grandparents to follow the instruction that the Apostle Paul gives us over in Ephesians, the 6th chapter, and the 4th verse, especially that second phrase. Now, we're familiar with the first phrase that starts with, "And you fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath." We look at that one. My kids really looked at that one often. "You fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath." But what does the second phrase of that verse say? It says, "But bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord." Two imperatives, two commands by Paul. Don't provoke your children to wrath. And then the opposite of that, the polar opposite of that, you bring them up in the training and the admonition of the Lord. It's our responsibility as Christians to do that. So this morning, I want to look at that responsibility to our children, spiritually speaking, and we're going to start in a passage that we're familiar with, one that I looked at recently with you, way over in Deuteronomy, the 6th chapter. That's where we're going to start. And we're going to take an overview now of this business of our responsibility to our children and our grandchildren, not only as they go back to school, but as we'll see in Deuteronomy, the 6th chapter. This is a 24/7, 365-day process for life. And then we're going to look at 3 different parents and learn the positives from them. And we'll interact perhaps when we look at those 3. But I want you to read with me now, beginning in the first verse of Deuteronomy, the 6th chapter, a passage we're all familiar with. The children of Israel are about to go into the promised land. And Moses is giving this instruction to heads of household. Now, dads, we're supposed to be the spiritual leader of the family. I grew up in a family that dad was a pretty good leader, but mama was better. And a lot of you did. And that's okay. But this is to heads of household. This is about leadership in regards to spiritual matters. It's our job. Moses said, now, and this is from the Lord, now this is the commandment, and these are the statutes and judgments which the Lord your God has commanded to teach you, that you may observe them in the land which you are crossing over to possess, that you may fear the Lord your God, to keep all his statutes and his commandments which I command you, you and your son and your grandson, all the days of your life, emphasis mine, and that your days may be prolonged. Therefore, hear, O Israel, and be careful to observe it, that it may be well with you, and that you may multiply greatly, as the Lord God of your fathers has promised you, a land flowing with milk and honey. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. You see the 24/7, 365 idea there? All the days of your life, verse 2, that we're to teach fear and respect and reverence to God. We're to teach that our children and our grandchildren are to keep his commandments. I'll remind you of John 14:15. What's John 14:15 say? If you love me, keep my commandments. You can teach your children how to love God, respect God, fear God. Well, keep his commandments. It never ends, Moses says. It's an all your life business. And then he says in verse 7 that we're to be diligent in that regard. Not lackadaisical, not half-heartedly, diligent. It's to be extremely important. It is of the utmost importance. And that communication of this is to be constant. We're to learn it on our own. We're to hold it in our heart. We're to teach it. We're to live it. We've mentioned Hebrews, the 5th chapter, beginning in the 12th verse recently. This business of ultimately we all have to become teachers. That starts first in the home. And that's the way we'll get the business of raising our kids and our grandkids in the proper fashion. And there are no guarantees, don't get me wrong. But it is imperative that you and I do just that. I sent Todd a text this morning. I was trying to go from my past experiences as a Waldron Public School Board member, how many instructional days were required under Arkansas school law. Anybody know? You teachers are out. I'm not going to let you vote. How many instructional days are required by... Janet's really close. She said 175. It's 178. I thought 180, and at one time it may have been 180. What's Moses say in Deuteronomy 6 about the spiritual education of our kids? It's an all-day, everyday deal. And unfortunately, like a lot of parents, I didn't follow that pattern. So I want us to look introspectively as parents and grandparents about this business of it being a lifelong, every day, all night opportunity. I'm trying to make up for some of that with my grandkids. We'll get to that here in just a minute. All right, 3 different parents. And I would guess that if I asked the audience 3 different parents in both the Old Testament and the New Testament that you could learn from in regards to faithfulness and service and the way they reared or raised their kids, that there'd be some overlap here with my list. But we're going to start with Hannah. Go to 1 Samuel 1. 1 Samuel 1. An interesting story, one that we're all familiar with. In verse 1 of chapter 1, we see that there's a man named Elkanah. He has 2 wives. One of them's named Hannah and one of them's named Peninnah. I think I got that right. Which one does he love the most? Hannah. Joey, what was Hannah's predicament? She's barren. I mean, the text even says that Elkanah gave her twice as much as he gave Peninnah. But Hannah could not have children, or had not had children. Did Peninnah take advantage of it, Joey? Yeah. Mean to her. And it's really, really getting to Hannah. They were of the mindset, from a faithfulness point of view, to observe all the religious days, if you will, that Jews were supposed to observe. They worshiped properly. They were faithful in that regard. They offered sacrificial service. And so the rest of the story in chapter 1 deals with this business of them being at Shiloh and offering their sacrifice and making their vows and worshiping properly under the guidelines of the law, if you will. And after they finished eating and drinking, in verse 9, Hannah arose, and Eli the priest was sitting at the seat by the doorpost of the tabernacle of God, and she was in bitterness of soul and prayed to the Lord and wept in anguish. Verse 11, then she made a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant and remember me and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a male child, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall come upon his head. What did Eli think? She's drunk. Chick's talking to herself. But she's praying. And I think one of the great lessons from us in regards to Hannah is this business of dedicating our children to the Lord. She's not bartering with God. She wants her kid to serve God. Now, our children can't serve in that capacity per se because we don't have the trappings of the temple and the tabernacle and all those types of things. But I will tell you that as somebody that preaches the gospel frequently, I worry about our young people becoming preachers. I worry about our young people becoming deacons. I worry about our young men becoming elders. And not to slight the ladies. Ladies, have you looked at the qualifications for elders and deacons lately? They've got to have good wives that are spiritually minded and supportive of those positions as well. And so what I learned from Hannah now is this dedication, this business of service, to purpose in our hearts that we do all that we can to prepare our children for spiritual success. What did she do every year once he was weaned? And that's a part of the preparation process, by the way. Once Samuel was weaned, what did she do every year when they went up to Shiloh to both worship and visit the young child Samuel? You remember what she did? Amy's got it, I think. She made him a tunic or a coat or an outer garment and an ephod. She made sure that she took care of him in regards to what he needed for his religious service. Anything else about Hannah you want to mention? But that's what I want us to take away from Hannah. She dedicated her kids to the Lord and service to the Lord. All right. Eunice and Lois. Go to 2 Timothy 1. Joey's grinning. Perhaps they were on his list. Eunice and Lois. 2 Timothy 1. A mother and grandmother. Verse 3, Paul says, I thank God whom I serve with a pure conscience, as my forefathers did, as without ceasing. I remember you in my prayers night and day, greatly desiring to see you, being mindful of your tears. Timothy's likely crying, if you will, over Paul's incarceration, that I may be filled with joy. When I call to remembrance the genuine faith that is in you, which dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and I am persuaded is in you also. I will tell you that I've always wanted my children to have a greater faith than my own. We need to install in our kids and our grandkids genuine faith, the James 2:14 type of faith. Not a shallow faith, not a veneer of faith, not a lukewarm faith, but a genuine faith, a faith that works, a faith that serves God and others. And what we learn from Eunice and Lois is it's got to first dwell, it's got to live in me as a parent and a grandparent. How can I expect my children and my grandchildren to be genuinely faithful if I'm not willing to do it? You know the answer to that question. And so I've got to have a good, genuine, working faith to properly 24/7, 365 influence my kids, my grandkids. And that's what the tail end of Deuteronomy 6 was, that passage that we read. That's what verses 7 through 9 were about. You got to have it right here. It's on your doorpost. It's where you live. It's got to dwell in you first. Well, how'd they get this faith? Turn over to chapter 3. Turn over to 2 Timothy 3. Paul goes on to say in verse 14, but you, speaking to Timothy, must continue in the things which you have learned and been assured of, knowing from whom you have learned them, and that from childhood you have known the Holy Scriptures. Who did that? His Bible class teacher on Sunday morning for 30 minutes. Wednesday night teacher for 40? No. Eunice and Lois. Which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith which is in Jesus Christ. That's how they got this faith. What's Paul say in Romans 10:17? So then, faith comes by what? Hearing. And hearing comes by what? The Word of God. You want your kids to be genuinely faithful? Get them in the Word. One of the great things we do at night when the grandkids are at the house is we read. Ford will almost unfailingly come to me at bedtime and say, "Papa, will you read me a story?" And they have a couple of books that they really like. They've got one that we brought them when we visited New York City that's about New York City. They've got one from Mackinac Island that is about Mackinac Island when we visited Mackinac. And we always buy them a book. When we go somewhere neat that perhaps they'll never get to go to or perhaps we want to take them to, we buy them a book. I try and temper that with a Bible story. I'll say, we're going to read one of those, but we're going to read a Bible story too. And you get to pick what the Bible story is. For 5-year-olds, you paraphrase it a little bit. It's okay. You don't have to read all the these and the thous. And then you talk to them about the lesson from Daniel and the lion's den. You talk to them about the lesson from David and Goliath. You talk to them about the lesson from Zacchaeus. Ford loves dinosaurs. We go to the end of Job, and we talk about God's description of a brachiosaurus, and he gets it. Now, he'll ask me how many millions of years ago that was, and then we got to go to Exodus 20 and Genesis 1 and 2. And we talk about how short the life of the earth is. That's the kind of education they're going to get, by the way, is that we're a gazillion years old. Well, we're not. And then last but not least, but that's how you do that. You get in the Word with your kids, your grandkids. Last but not least, Abraham and Sarah. And I want to leave you with them. Did they always get it right, by the way? Joey's shaking his head no. No, they didn't always get it right. What's the story of Genesis 22 when they finally do get the promised child? What's Abraham asked to do with this promised child? Sacrifice him, kill him. I just got him. You want me to kill him? I've waited 100 years for him. Not really, but a long time. He's 100 years old. We need to understand that there will be times when we have extreme tests as parents and grandparents. The most difficult of spiritual tests will come our way as parents and grandparents. Do not think that to be odd or strange. But like Abraham and Sarah, we must have great faith and trust in God, and regardless of the situation. Turn last, if you would, now over to Hebrews, the 11th chapter. Hebrews, the 11th chapter. Verse 17, by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was called, in Isaac your seed shall be called. Genesis 21:12. Now look at verse 19. Concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from which he also had received him in a figurative sense. Reproductively, Abraham and Sarah were dead when Isaac was born. Paul talks about that in Romans, the 4th chapter, beginning with the 13th verse. And he'll go on to say there that contrary to hope, in hope, Abraham believed. The Hebrew writer will say hope is the anchor of our soul, by the way. He'll also say that Abraham didn't waver at the promise of God, but was fully convinced that God would keep his promises. So the takeaways from Abraham and Sarah, you understand your faith will be tested as parents and grandparents in regards to your children and your grandchildren. And you must trust in God regardless of the situation. Your hope must be anchored in him, and you must not waver at the promise. We could spend a lot more time on that, but let's take a little break. Our classes will start